Now that we have completed part one of A Thousand Splendid Suns, I thought I would go back over some of those key points I made before we started about narrative technique in Hosseini's work. Our first narrator is Mariam. It's told from the third person, but it's her limited perspective. There are a few moments of foretelling or awareness where Hosseini might say years later or something to that effect. In that case, he's sort of piquing our interest, but withholding information as well. Um, we also don't get Jalil's true feelings until we see the events unfold, just like is happening to Mariam. We don't understand Nana's mental illness. We don't understand her depression. We see her as Mariam does, sort of bitter and angry, but we don't really understand the impetus of it. And it's only in doled out kind of carefully as we go, allowing us to dislike Nana in like Jalil at first until his true feelings are revealed, and then also we're shocked at Nana's death. So we also are sort of aligning ourselves with Mariam because of her innocence in this matter and the brutal inequities she's facing. Finally, the sort of withheld limited perspective means that we don't know Rashid's intent until Mariam knows his intent. And we have to experience that anxiety and tension just like she is theoretically experiencing it. So as you continue through the novel, think about how is Hosseini giving us information? How is he withholding it? What do you think would happen if our narration was from Nana's perspective, or Jalil's, or an omniscient perspective, or a first person perspective? That kind of changes how we feel. I think Mariam might feel maybe a little more whiny if it was from a first person perspective. So think about those sorts of pieces. Hosseini carefully crafts this work in order to have you feel the way he wants you to feel, think the way he wants you to think. He's a master manipulator. And this enables him to create suspense and shock, and Mariam's disillusion is ours. This limited perspective can create irony and contrast. For example, our next section is going to be narrated by Lila, who is sort of a foil again to Mariam. So she has some similar experiences. She's a female in Afghanistan, and yet her voice is different. So it contrasts with Mariam's. And likewise, each narrator has a different set of words that align with her narration. The structure of part one is mostly chronological, but think back and pay attention to when it isn't. The significant jumps in time serve to kind of form his narration, particularly through his use of historical events. Between part one and part two, we're going to jump ahead 9 years so that Hosseini can structure his novel around these historical events. He needs his characters to be a certain age at a certain time in the historical events for this to sort of masterfully unfold. And so that structure is significantly tied to historical events. Jumping back up, the contrast can be a structural event or a structural technique as well. So you can pay attention to when he maybe contrasts in mood or tone or point of view, or if it goes from Mariam's narration to Rashid's comments, that contrast is a structural device as well. Sentence structure can also fall under structure when you think about his use of fragmentation, lists, repetition. Those are all structural devices as well as linguistic devices. And so far, I think the strongest piece of that has been his use of fragmentation. So don't hesitate to focus on things like that. A short sentence, a long sentence, those are created on purpose for an effect. So what would that effect be? As we shift into part 2, notice that the overall structure of the novel has these multiple narrative voices. It has different parts, and the dates, like I said earlier, form the structure of the narrative. And the events sort of parallel these historical events. Hosseini also uses setting as a technique. It creates conflict and forms character in this novel. So we couldn't have Mariam being born and raised in 21st century US because the sort of primary premise of her abandonment, I guess, if you will, is that she's a harami, that she's an illegitimate daughter. And in the US, your sort of fathership is not considered when you're, walking through your day to day. In Afghanistan, Mariam literally had no legal rights, or would if she existed, right? And so when she is sort of trying to beg for some other opportunities, she is literally beholden to whatever her father decides. Additional conflicts that we're going to see. We've already seen a little bit of that conflict in education, the haves and have-nots. That's a gender issue as well. As the narrative unfolds, we will see that there's conflict with the wars, there's unrest, there's drought, politics, the urban versus rural creates a different conflict. We even see that in part 1. Mariam's understanding of the world is quite different than the people in Kabul. When she gets there, she's sort of, her eyes are opened to a whole world of people. Medical knowledge also plays a part. Nana's seizure disorder would be just that, or would be medicated and she wouldn't have seizures. And instead, she's looked upon as sort of evil, like demonic possession has taken hold of her, and the superstitions that go with that as well. And there will be other medical issues. These, of course, also form those global issues to some extent. So you might want to sort of hold on to some of that information. Additionally, a primary purpose of this narrative is to pay homage to Afghanistan, its resilience, the power of the people, the power to sort of regenerate after all of this political and violent strife that has occurred in the culture. He does so right away when he addresses how Afghanistan at one point was sort of this mecca of culture, and then we will see it as we progress through. He also is giving you that historical piece and the cultural significance of Afghanistan, these allusions to specific dates. He wants you to sort of identify these dates, these places. He talks about the minarets and the Sufi tree. All of these things are kind of places that that are meant to endear you to this place called Afghanistan. And then he is going to create setting through imagery and allusion and anecdote, description, word choice, etc. So pay close attention to those things. And the title, A Thousand Splendid Suns, we'll get to this eventually, but it is a reference to a poem that celebrates Afghanistan and Kabul particularly. Let's focus for a second on his use of history in this passage that takes place in April in 1978. Next, I want to talk about characterization. Characterization is created through dialogue, description, imagery, internal monologue. Even verbs. The Hosseini strongly uses verbs to associate different characters. So pay attention to the verbs, particularly in the dialogues between Rashid and Mariam. They become really important. Um, Additionally, pay attention to those motivations and backstory that Hosseini includes and the images associated. So we have Jalil and his brown suit and the handkerchief and the car. Mariam is always associated with her long face. Rashid, oh my goodness, look at the way he eats, right? So he's always wiping the grease with the sleeve or with the back of his hand. When we're first introduced to him, it's a really important passage. Authors will also use not only those physical descriptors, but what others say about them, what they do, and what they say as primary moments and ways to connote what kind of character this is. When you're writing about characters, you can also consider the type of character they might be. So are they foils to another character, meaning equal but opposite? Are they the protagonist, the antagonist, an anti-hero? Are they stock characters? Are they stereotyped characters? Are they symbolic characters? Those are all different types of characters that might help you to analyze this work. And here's that passage where we first are introduced to Rashid. As we talked about earlier, Hosseini employs symbolism fairly frequently. It's mostly simple and direct, almost overt. His historical events symbolize characters and vice versa. The pebble game symbolizes Mariam's isolation and her longing to be part of the family. The willow is a weeping willow, and as the curtain parts, we get to see Mariam. The china breaking right before it, where it's indicated that it's to ward off evil, and then she breaks it. The gun is a symbol of what? Power and violence. The hijab is used in a number of different ways, as is the burqa. The various head coverings are used to connote sort of different moments of either worship or power or respect, those sorts of things. Khaled Hosseini's meals are often symbolic as well. So think about the way Hosseini used meals. Think about right at the end of our part. He kind of combines a number of symbols, the pebbles, and then also just the use of the meals to indicate how Mariam and Rashid's relationship is going is usually indicated by what Rashid feels about the food and the conversation and the food itself. So pay attention in part 2 as well. Hosseini will continue to use meals as indicators. And then pay attention in part 2 to his connections from part to part. So allusions to other characters, comparison to other characters, references and whatnot. They're sort of little Easter eggs for you, if you will. And other go-to techniques are going to include repetition. We already talked about syntax as far as structure is concerned. His use of italics during the second part of part 1 to indicate Mariam's thought process is really important, and her memories of Nana, her memories of Jalil, those all are pretty important. He also uses your traditional simile, metaphor, personification. He'll parallel his scenes occasionally. So you had the 2 scenes on the bus coming back from the doctor's office, and then his use of tension. Some general topics will continue to see those inequities, the role of education, and the role of power.